A sitting United States president just admitted on national television that his administration tried to smuggle guns into Iran. The weapons were supposed to reach protesters, risking their lives in the streets. They never arrived. He says the Kurds took them. The Kurds say they received nothing. And right now, somewhere between that lie and that truth, people are dying. The question is not whether the guns are coming. The question is whether they already did, and what happens next. What you are watching right now may be the most consequential foreign policy pivot since Ronald Reagan funded guerrillas in the mountains of Afghanistan. And just like 1980, the decision is being made in real time, in public, with all the messy contradictions that come with it. Here is what we are going to break down for you tonight. First, we will tell you exactly what Trump said, what he admitted, and why those words have set off a firestorm that reaches from Washington to Tehran to the Kurdish mountains of northern Iraq. Second, we will take you deep into the Reagan Doctrine, what it was, what it accomplished, and what it cost, and show you how history is rhyming right now in ways that should make every informed citizen pay very close attention. Third, we will show you the human cost already being paid on the ground. A 19-year-old Kurdish fighter named Ghazal Molan, executed in a drone strike during a supposed ceasefire, and ask whether Washington is prepared to accept the consequences of what it is setting in motion. We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a breaking update. The world is moving fast. This channel keeps up. Let us get into it. It started with a radio interview. President Trump was speaking to the Hugh Hewitt show when the conversation turned to the protests inside Iran. The demonstrations, the crackdowns, the millions of Iranians who have risked everything to oppose the Islamic Republic since the killing of their supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, in the joint U.S.-Israeli strikes of late February 2026. Trump's words were blunt, unfiltered, and almost immediately historic. He said Iranians would fight back if they had weapons. He said they have to have guns. And then he went further. He said he believed they were getting some, and that once they had them, they would fight as well as anyone in the world. That alone would have been explosive. But then came Fox News Sunday in early April, and Trump added a new layer that left analysts, officials, and dissidents stunned. He admitted his administration had tried to send firearms to Iranian protesters through Kurdish channels. The effort failed. And his explanation for why? The Kurds, he suggested, took the guns. That is a sitting president acknowledging a covert weapons transfer attempt to civilians inside a hostile nation in a live television interview. No intelligence briefing, no congressional authorization, no diplomatic cover, just the president on Sunday morning describing what sounds like a covert operation that may have gone sideways. Within hours, that admission was detonating across Washington, Tehran, and every opposition network in the Iranian diaspora. To understand why this is so significant, you need to understand two things: what happened to Iran in the weeks before this story broke, and what the Reagan Doctrine actually was. First, Iran. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike campaign against Iranian military infrastructure. Those strikes killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. That single event, the death of the man who had ruled Iran for over 3 decades, sent shockwaves through the Islamic Republic that have not stopped reverberating. The regime did not collapse, but it staggered. The Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, moved aggressively to maintain control, deploying violence against protesters and blacking out the internet to conceal the scale of the damage. Oil depots burned, smoke rose over Tehran, and a population that had been protesting in waves since 2019, through the Woman, Life, Freedom Uprising of 2022, through currency collapses, through crackdowns that have seen thousands imprisoned and hundreds executed, that population felt something it had not felt in a generation: a window. Now, the Reagan Doctrine. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan built a foreign policy framework around a simple idea. The Soviet Union was overextended. It was funding proxy governments across the developing world. And rather than confront the USSR directly, the United States would arm, fund, and train the people fighting back against those governments. Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Angola, Cambodia. The doctrine was never formally announced. It was simply practiced, and it changed the course of the Cold War. The results were mixed. In Afghanistan, it helped expel the Soviets, and then created the conditions for the Taliban. In Nicaragua, it fueled a brutal civil war and a congressional scandal. In Angola, it prolonged a conflict that killed hundreds of thousands. The point is not that the Reagan Doctrine was good or bad. The point is that it was consequential. And now, in 2026, that framework is being explicitly revived, by name, in the context of Iran. Remember the question we opened with? Did the guns actually make it into Iran? We are going to answer that. And the answer is more complicated than anyone in Washington is admitting. This story is driven by a small number of voices, but each one matters. Let us go through them. President Donald Trump is the center of gravity here. He floated the idea publicly, admitted to an attempted covert transfer, and has repeatedly expressed sympathy for armed resistance inside Iran. His language is not careful. It is not diplomatic. And that is partly the point. Trump's instinct is to speak into the void, to signal, to move the Overton window on what is acceptable to discuss. Senator Lindsey Graham is the most vocal institutional advocate. He appeared on Hannity and called for what he described as a Second Amendment solution inside Iran. His exact words, "If I were President Trump and I were Israel, I would load the Iranian people up with weapons so they could go to the streets armed and turn the tide of battle inside Iran." That is a sitting United States senator calling for mass civilian armament of a foreign population on primetime television. Brett Velicovich is the operational voice. A former U.S. military and intelligence specialist focused on drone warfare, he runs a company called PowerUs and has become one of the most prominent public advocates for what he calls Reagan Doctrine 2.0. He argues that the technological landscape has changed the calculus entirely. Cheap FPV drones, loitering munitions, small arms. These tools allow motivated fighters to challenge even well-equipped state militaries. He calls it democratizing power, and he argues there has never been a better moment. On the other side, you have Sardar Pashai, a former Iranian wrestling champion, now the director of the Hiwa Foundation based in the United States, serving Kurdish Iranian communities. He is not opposed to regime change, but he is deeply alarmed by the public nature of these discussions. When the regime hears a U.S. senator talking about arming protesters, it does not need evidence of a plot. It manufactures one, and people die. Then there is Reza Pahlavi, the exiled crown prince of Iran, son of the last Shah. He has become a rallying figure for a significant portion of the diaspora and has been referenced during protests inside Iran. He is urging the international community not to give Tehran a lifeline. His message? The window is open. Do not let it close. And finally, the MEK, the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran. Controversial does not begin to cover it. Designated as a terrorist organization by the U.S. until 2012, the MEK has a history of violence, a cult-like internal structure, and powerful friends in Washington who have advocated for them for years. They recently posted videos claiming to target regime centers and symbols of repression in retaliation for the execution of 2 of their members. These are the people who would receive support under any Reagan Doctrine 2.0, and deciding between them is not a bureaucratic exercise. It is a decision about who shapes the future of a nation of 90 million people. While Washington debates doctrine, people in Iran and on Iran's borders are dying. The Kurdish communities, both inside Iran and in the semi-autonomous Kurdish regions of Iraq, are among the most exposed. Kurdish political and military organizations have long been among the most organized anti-regime forces on Iran's periphery. They have paid an enormous price for it. Sardar Pashai, speaking to Fox News Digital, delivered a number that cuts through all the geopolitical abstraction. During the supposed ceasefire period following the U.S.-Israeli strikes, Kurdish opposition groups were targeted more than 30 times by Iranian drone and missile attacks. 4 young Kurdish Peshmerga fighters were killed. One of them was 19-year-old Ghazal Molan. Let that land for a moment. A ceasefire, 30 strikes, a 19-year-old dead. Inside Iran itself, the regime's internet blackout, condemned by Israeli officials as designed to conceal both the damage from strikes and to suppress internal dissent, has made it nearly impossible to verify conditions on the ground. What we know comes through fragmentary reports, activists communicating through satellite connections, and the occasional video that escapes the blackout. What those sources describe is a country that is simultaneously more restless and more repressed than at any point since the 1979 revolution. Currency collapses have wiped out savings. The economy is under stranglehold from U.S. sanctions and a naval blockade. The leadership is in disarray following the killing of Khamenei, and the IRGC, while still militarily formidable, is operating in an environment where its legitimacy is openly questioned by millions of Iranians. The MEK, meanwhile, is not sitting still. Their videos show what they describe as active operations targeting regime infrastructure. Whether those videos represent real capacity or effective propaganda is a question Western intelligence is actively trying to answer. But here's the part that almost no one is talking about, and it changes everything. The Reagan Doctrine did not just arm fighters. It created them. It built networks. Some of those networks outlasted their usefulness and became the enemies of the next generation. Washington is debating whether to do this again, and it has not answered the most important question: who exactly are we building? If you are finding this analysis valuable, subscribe right now. We are just getting to the part that should keep every policymaker in Washington up at night. The reaction to Trump's remarks has split along predictable but consequential lines. Inside the United States, Republican hawks have largely embraced the framing. Senator Graham's appearance on Hannity was not a lone voice. It reflected a growing wing of the GOP foreign policy establishment that believes regime change in Iran is not only possible, but within reach, and that the moment demands boldness rather than caution. Democrats have been largely silent on this specific debate, a striking absence given the magnitude of what is being proposed. The few who have commented have expressed alarm at the chaotic and public nature of the discussion, pointing out that covert operations work precisely because they are covert. In Israel, the reaction is more complex than it might appear. Israeli officials have long supported regime change in Iran as a strategic goal. But some analysts inside Israel are warning privately that a fractured, armed, and civil war-torn Iran could in some ways be more destabilizing than the regime itself, a source of weapons proliferation, refugee flows, and ungoverned space on Israel's strategic perimeter. In Europe, the silence is deafening. The major European powers, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, have invested years in attempting diplomatic engagement with Iran. The open discussion of arming Iranian civilians blows past every framework those governments have constructed. None of them have publicly commented on Trump's admission about the Kurdish weapons transfer. Russia and China are watching carefully. Both have strategic relationships with Iran. Both have long accused the United States of pursuing regime change as a foreign policy tool. Trump's comments have handed them a propaganda gift of considerable proportions. Expect both Moscow and Beijing to use this rhetoric as justification for their own proxy support networks going forward. Among the Iranian diaspora, the reaction is divided and deeply personal. Some exiles see this as the moment they have waited for. Others are terrified that their family members inside Iran will be caught in the crossfire of a conflict shaped by politicians who have never set foot in the country. Here is what mainstream coverage is missing. The debate about whether to arm Iranian resistance fighters is happening as if it is a future policy question. But based on Trump's own admission, it is not a hypothetical. It has already been attempted. Weapons were moved. Something went wrong. And now the United States government has publicly acknowledged a covert operation that failed, while simultaneously signaling its intention to try again. That is extraordinarily unusual. Covert programs, when they fail, are typically buried. The Bay of Pigs was acknowledged only under duress. Iran-Contra became a constitutional crisis. U.S. arms to Afghan mujahideen were not officially confirmed for years. Trump's casual acknowledgement on Fox News Sunday in the middle of an interview represents either a dramatic break with the norms of operational security, or it is itself a deliberate signal. A message to the Iranian opposition: we tried, we are committed, we will do it again. A message to Tehran: we are coming at you from within. A message to American voters: we are serious about finishing what we started. The second hidden angle involves the MEK. This organization is deeply controversial within the Iranian opposition itself. Many Iranian dissidents regard the MEK with suspicion or outright hostility, viewing them as a cultish organization that collaborated with Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War and has a history of targeting Iranian civilians. If U.S. support flows toward the MEK, even implicitly, it could fracture the opposition rather than unite it, handing the regime a political gift precisely when it is most vulnerable. The third hidden angle is the drone dimension. Brett Velicovich's point about FPV drones is not rhetorical flourish. Iran itself has built a decentralized drone production capability in basement factories, reportedly using Chinese components. If the U.S. supplies similar capability to resistance networks, the resulting conflict would look less like the Afghan insurgency of the 1980s and more like the drone-saturated battlefields of Ukraine: urban, precise, impossible to contain, and devastating to civilian infrastructure. The question is not whether a Reagan Doctrine 2.0 is being considered. The evidence suggests it is already underway. The real question is, who controls it, and who gets left holding the consequences? Subscribe now if you want to follow this story as it develops. What comes next will define the next decade of Middle East policy. Let us be very specific about what is on the table. Iran is not a small country. It has a population of approximately 90 million people. It controls the Strait of Hormuz, the single choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every day. It has proxy networks across Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Gaza that have spent decades being built, funded, and armed by the Revolutionary Guard. If the regime collapses in a controlled, negotiated transition, the world gets a different Iran, less hostile, potentially open to reintegration, a massive economy, rich in energy, agriculture, and educated human capital, released from sanctions and reoriented toward the global system. If the regime collapses in a civil war, the world gets a different problem: armed factions, ethnic fragmentation, a potential Syria-scale humanitarian disaster, but larger. Kurdish groups in the northwest, Baloch insurgents in the southeast, Arab separatists in Khuzestan, Azeri communities in the northwest with their own political aspirations, each one with a flag, a grievance, and, potentially, a weapons supplier. If the regime survives, weakened, enraged, and now aware that the United States is actively attempting to arm internal resistance, Tehran's response is entirely predictable. It doubles down on repression. It accelerates whatever remains of its nuclear program, and it activates every proxy network it possesses across the region. The economic stakes alone are staggering. A disruption to the Strait of Hormuz, even temporary, would send oil prices into territory not seen since the 1970s. Global supply chains, still fragile from years of disruption, would feel it immediately. And the populations of developing nations, already under pressure from food costs and energy prices, would bear the heaviest burden. The analytical community is not unified, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But there are clear fault lines. Those who support a more aggressive posture argue that the current moment is genuinely unprecedented. The killing of Khamenei removed the single figure who had held the Islamic Republic's competing factions together for 35 years. The successor leadership is weaker, less legitimate, and operating in a context of economic collapse and military embarrassment. They argue that the window for internal change is real and narrow, and that failing to act means watching the regime reconsolidate, potentially with nuclear capability. Brett Velicovich frames it as a technology argument. The monopoly on violence, the thing that allowed regimes to suppress uprisings throughout history, is breakable in 2026 in ways it simply was not in 1980. Cheap drones change the math. A motivated, organized resistance with eyes in the sky and precision strike capability is not the same thing as protesters with rocks and Molotov cocktails. He argues the comparison to Cold War proxy wars misses this fundamental shift. Those who counsel caution raise equally serious points. Sardar Prashai's concern that public discussion of arming protesters gives the regime a pretext to execute people is not theoretical. It has happened before. The Islamic Republic has a documented history of fabricating espionage cases against dissidents by pointing to real or imagined foreign support. Every time a U.S. senator goes on television and calls for arming Iranians, the regime's security apparatus gets busier. There is also the question of legitimacy and democratic process. The United States Congress has not authorized anything resembling a covert arming program inside Iran. The admission that weapons were already attempted through Kurdish channels raises immediate questions under the War Powers Framework and decades of intelligence oversight legislation. Who authorized that operation? Was it briefed to the relevant congressional committees? The silence on those questions is conspicuous. And strategically, analysts point to the historical record of Reagan Doctrine operations. Every one of them produced unintended consequences that outlasted the original objective. The Afghan Mujahideen became the Taliban. The Nicaraguan Contras became a constitutional crisis. Arming fractious opposition movements rarely produces stable democracies. It frequently produces new conflicts. Remember the question we opened with? Did any weapons actually make it into Iran? Here is what we now know, and it is more complicated than either side wants to admit. The answer appears to be some were sent, none were confirmed received, multiple Kurdish groups denied it, and at least 4 people are dead in the region that was supposed to be the conduit. That is the situation on the ground, not a policy debate, a covert operation with real casualties and no accountability. 3 scenarios. Label them honestly. Best case, the regime continues to weaken from within. A combination of economic pressure and internal dissent produces a negotiated transition led by moderate elements within Iran, possibly military commanders who break with hardline ideology, and the international community manages to support that transition without triggering a civil war. The weapons discussion recedes, replaced by a diplomatic framework. Iran rejoins the global economy. The Strait of Hormuz stabilizes. A generation of Iranian scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs, many of them already in the diaspora, begin rebuilding. This is possible. It has happened before in history. It requires patience and coordination that Washington has not recently demonstrated. Likely case. The regime consolidates around a successor leadership, possibly drawn from the IRGC itself, which uses the combination of genuine patriotic sentiment and fear of foreign interference to hold the country together. U.S. efforts to arm resistance networks achieve limited, scattered impact, enough to sustain low-level insurgency in Kurdish and Baluch regions, not enough to threaten the center. The conflict grinds on. Sanctions remain. The nuclear program advances in the background. The discussion about a Reagan Doctrine 2.0 becomes a permanent feature of Washington's Iran debate without ever becoming coherent policy. Worst case, a covert weapons program scales up enough to give resistance networks real capacity, triggering a violent regime response that escalates into something approaching civil war. Ethnic factions receive competing support from different external patrons, the U.S. and Israel backing some, Russia and China backing others through Tehran. The conflict destabilizes Iraq and Turkey simultaneously, both of which share borders and Kurdish populations with Iran. The Strait of Hormuz is threatened or closed. Oil spikes to levels that shock the global economy.
And the United States finds itself, as it has before, having set a fire it cannot control. We want to hear from you. This story is not just geopolitical abstraction. It is a question about how the world works and who gets to make those decisions. Here are the two questions we are putting to you tonight. First, do you believe the United States should actively arm resistance networks inside Iran? Not debate it, not consider it, actually do it, covertly, at scale. Tell us where you stand and why. Second, if a covert operation is already underway, as Trump's own words suggest, should Congress be told? Should there be oversight? Or do you believe that in situations like this, the president must act without the constraints of public accountability? Leave your answers below. This community is one of the most informed audiences covering global news, and this conversation is worth having. We read every comment. 3 things to take away from everything you have just heard. 1, this is not a hypothetical. Trump's admission that the U.S. attempted to send weapons through Kurdish channels means a covert operation has already been attempted. Whether it succeeded or failed is unknown. What is known is that real people have already died in the region it passed through. 2, the Reagan Doctrine was not a clean policy. It produced the Taliban, it produced Iran-Contra, and it produced the end of the Cold War. Anyone who invokes it should be required to reckon with all 3 outcomes, not just the convenient one. 3, the window that dissidents are describing, the weakness of the regime, the disarray following Khamenei's death, the economic collapse, the simmering population, that window is real. Whether it opens into a democratic Iran or a shattered one depends on decisions being made right now, in rooms most of us will never enter. What happens in the next 72 hours could shift the trajectory of this crisis. A new strike, a diplomatic breakthrough, a weapons shipment confirmed, a resistance network exposed. Any of those events would reshape this story entirely. This story is not over. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when it breaks, we will be the first to cover it. The most dangerous words in foreign policy have always been, "It seemed like a good idea at the time."